And so we get home, and then I go to school again. And then after that, I get drafted. Now, I've already gone down to my draft a couple of times to be drafted, and they've just taken me and sent me home. But now I'm 24 years old. By the time I've gone on a mission when I'm 21 and a half, and I stay for another, so I'm 24 years old. So they'll draft me even with a student deferment then. And so I go down there, they give me my physical, and I'm on the plane ready to go on my mission. Now, the most important thing about my mission was our prophet had told us that if we were going to be drafted, we could take off our garments if we wanted to. And I says, I don't want to go to a war without my garments on, so I kept them. So because I kept my garments, I was able to go with a different MOS. So with I went in the Army in September, and so I would have been on my way to Vietnam by the 1st of January or the end of December. So because I had this other MOS, it took me clear to March to get my MOS. So I got a lot of training. We were back in Virginia, and I went home for Christmas, and we had that leave, and then we drove back, and we drove a car back so we could go up to Washington, D.C. And then we drove home from Washington, D.C. And then we stayed for a while, and then we had to leave. And so we flew out to go to Vietnam. But I went to Fort Ord, California, and it don't exist anymore. So we went to Fort Ord, and I was a miserable little guy because I didn't want to be there, but I could get away with things really, really good. So I learned how, first of all, because I got in trouble for jumping off of a truck one time because I jumped over the side instead of jumping off the back. And so they got mad at me, and they says, well, get down and do 100 push-ups. So I got down, and I done 100 push-ups real easy because on my mission I started doing 10 push-ups. I'd do one push-up, and then I'd stand up and do another. And so I had no problem doing 100 push-ups. So I got up, and the guy that was with me, he got to do more. So then we'd go to the rifle range. Now this is the thing the Lord says. The Lord says, cease to sleep longer than is needful. But he never tells us what's needful. But the Army told me what was needful. You only need 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night. And if you get that, then you can go to the rifle range and you won't kill anybody because you're going to be wide awake because you're not sleeping very long at night. So I'd go to bed at 11 o'clock and get up at 4 o'clock, and that was it. That was our 5 hours. So we'd run 6 miles to the rifle range, and then we'd shoot our guns all day, and then we were supposed to run 6 miles again back home. We're running 6 miles back home. I just walk instead of running because all these other guys, they were low crawling up the sandy hill, you know. So I'd run up the sandy hill, and then when I'd get to the top of the hill, the platoon would leave, and I'd just sit there and walk along. So the captain sticks his head out the window, and he says, Tibbets, were you the last one? And I says, yes. I thought so. And that's all he said. So then I got so I could sleep in the morning, and I wouldn't have to get up. This wasn't when I was going to the rifle range. And they come up there, and I got out of there, and I didn't get caught. For the second time, I got caught up there sleeping. So the drill sergeant takes us out there, and he has us all standing at attention. And then he says, okay, now, you guys are going to go through, and he goes through this whole list. And so I'm standing there at attention. When you're at attention, you can't even touch your nose. You have to stand at attention. So I just broke my formation and walked away. So the sergeant says, Tibbets, where are you going? And I says, you're making me sick. I'm going to sick leave. So I wouldn't have graduated from that boot camp if I would have went. So that's the end of the story. So I stayed all that time in the hospital. So the only reason I won, I didn't do all these things that I had to do to graduate, but I graduated anyway because I run the 20 miles at the end of the thing because my captain comes along and says, Tibbets, didn't you just get out of the hospital? You want to ride? And I says, no, I'd like to try this. And so I finished the race, and so I got to go. So I'm going on my way to Vietnam. So I go up and I get a blessing from my dad. So it's the only time he's ever given me a blessing or anything. So he gives me a blessing that I won't fire my weapon. Now, I forgot all about that blessing, but my dad remembered it because my mom would tell him about it all the time. I don't know why you're sending him to war and telling him he can't fire his weapon. So anyway, so I get to go home, and so that's when he gives me my blessing after I graduated from boot camp. And so then I fly out to go to Vietnam. And so I go to Vietnam, and we have to stop in Tokyo because we didn't have any good airplanes in those days. So we had to stop in Tokyo, and then I went to Vietnam. And so Vietnam is a really neat place. People are being baptized over there now. And people are, in fact, I always wondered if I learned how to actually love my enemy. So Kay and I went on a mission to Canada. So we went to the mission home up here in Salt Lake. And when we did, or to the MTC, and so when we did, is the first time missionaries had ever come from Vietnam to go on a mission. And so I felt like, I guess I have learned how to love my enemy. And I think that's an important part of going to Vietnam, to love your enemy, because the enemy's killing you. So anyway, I go to Vietnam, and so I have to go through this training. So I go through this, they have this building that's probably twice as long as our house is, and it's Seattle. And they got CS gas in there, so that's worse than tear gas. So I'm walking through, and people are laying on the floor, crawling, trying to get out of there. So I got so upset with them doing that to those guys. The next day we were supposed to go out and qualify with our weapon. So I decided, I'm not going to qualify with my weapon. So I went out swimming in the China Sea. So I didn't go out and qualify with my weapon. So somehow or other, because my dad gave me that blessing, I went through that without even remembering it or nothing. I didn't have to fire my weapon or anything. So in Vietnam, I got 2 MOSs. So they says, well, we need a crew chief, but we don't have a bird. We don't have a helicopter for you. So I raised my hand. I'm ready to go. So as soon as I got a bird, I left. So I went over and I got this roommate that nobody liked because he's a Golden Glove boxer. And so he sitting there on the bed. So you can go on a 3-day R&R. You can go on a 7-day R&R. Now 7 days give you 7 days in company. But you can't get a 7-day leave. You can't go to your captain and say, I'd like to get a 7-day leave. You can't do that. Nobody gets a 7-day leave. You get a 7-day R&R, but the captain or whoever gives you the right always turns you down. So this guy comes in to get me because I locked up all the captain's tools. So the captain's madder than heck because he was going to take that helicopter around the hill once and get it fixed. But now he can't fix it because I've locked up all the tools. So he sends this big guy in to talk to me. And he's probably a head taller than me. And my companion's sitting there on the bed. And this guy swears at me because I'm not paying any attention. I'm not going out with him. And so my companion says, you don't swear to Tibbets. He's a Mormon. And so he says, I'm not talking to you. And he says, so you need to get and we need to go out and talk to that captain. And he swears at me again. So my roommate says, don't swear at him. And he says, you just sit there and be calm, because he's a little guy, he only comes to my shoulder. So he says another swear word to me. Well, my roommate is off that bed. He hits that guy 3 times. That's how come they sit there and fight the balls like that, because they can hit 3 times and it's like they've hit him once. So they hit him, he hits him, and that guy goes flying out of my room across the hall and smashes against the wall on the other side. And he goes out there and the captain says, where's Tibbetts? And he's got blood running all over his chest and everything. And he says he don't want to come. So I go out the next morning and I says to the captain, I says, so are you mad at me? Oh man, he's sitting up there in the helicopter seat and he's just madder than heck, and he's sitting up there above me and I'm standing down there on the flight line and he's just ready to kill me. He says, oh, I'm ready to kill you. He says, I'm mad at you. I says, you want to get rid of me? He says, how? I says, just sign right here and I'm gone. And so he signed my 7-day leaves and I'm gone. I went to Australia again. The thing that's really important about my serving Vietnam is President Hinckley went over there 3 times, 3 different years, and organized the church. So the church was organized in Vietnam. And I don't think very many members know that the church was organized. So we had a branch, and we had a branch president. We had what we'd call a district president over there. We'd call him a stake president here. So he'd come and set us apart in those leadership positions. And so it was really neat. And then we'd have a family home evening. Now we called it family home evening. Now the church, if you're doing it as single, they call it a home evening. But we called it a family home evening, and we had it every Wednesday because that was kind of the middle of the week. And there wasn't a lot of us went, but because we had to walk probably a mile to get there. And it was right by the POW camp when we got to church. And it was just a little wood building that we went to. But after we were there for a year, for about 6 months, this elder he's just a priest, I guess. He walks up to us. He was in the infantry. And he says, I'd like to figure out a way that I can go home, because I'm going to go home from Vietnam pretty soon, and I'm going to be there for a little while for leave. And I'd like to be able to get married in the temple, but I'm not worthy to get married in the temple right now. And I want you to correspond with my stake president so I can go home and get married in the temple, and then my wife can go with me. So the interesting thing is, we used to have 4 stake conferences a year back then. So one of them was President Benson. And so President Benson, there's 2,000 people there. Now this is a story about the Brethren. 2,000 people there. We're in a hangar. It's just a big, huge congregation. So I went to this other one with this guy that wanted to get home, and Bruce R. McConkie comes over. Now, you think these brethren know a little bit, but they know a lot. He had a little tiny room that probably 50, 60 people could have fit in, and there was 30 or 40 of us there. Bruce R. McConkie came around and shook every one of our hands. And as he did that, he decided what he was going to talk about. And it's a totally worthless thing to talk about, because who can get married in the temple in Vietnam? And so the 40 people that were there or so, they were listening to this for nothing, because they couldn't even get married. But Ralph, he's the one that was coming to church all the time. He was in the infantry, and he'd fly in. The helicopters would bring him in, and he'd stay overnight. He'd be all cleaned up. He could come to church, and then he had to go back to his company. So he's sitting there, preparing to go home and get married in the temple. So Bruce R. McConkie says, today I'm going to tell you about temple marriage. And he did that for the one, because the rest of us wasn't going home. And that teaches you. And also, he didn't have to have a big room with 20,000 people in it or 2,000 people in it or anything like that. He could just have a couple of people that were going to need that. And that's the way the brethren think. So in Vietnam, I had that beginning with President Hinckley. And then at the end, I had that with Bruce R. McConkie. So the thing is that's really hard to understand is the garment of the priesthood, which women receive, which President Nelson talks about a lot, I think is so, so important. So because I had white garments on, because they didn't have green and tan garments in those days, and so because I had white garments, I couldn't put anybody in danger. So that's why I got the MOS of a helicopter, either crew chief or mechanic, because I didn't have to do that because I had white garments and they couldn't put me out there. People would say, will you walk out to the bunker with me? They were glad when I went to the bunker with them. They were glad of things like that. They liked the extra protection of the garment, even though they'd never wore it. And I've seen a lot of things, people in Vietnam, I won't tell you a lot of the stuff, but they all smoked pot and stuff, and it was a bad place. And when they'd go out on guard duty, just like that guy I told you about, he wanted to smoke, and so he fell asleep. And that's why so many people died over there, was because of that, and because of other things. And I stayed over there for an extra 14 days. So when I came home, I was completely free. Now this, I've told you some spiritual things about it. So I'm walking around Fort Lewis, and this colonel walks by, and he salutes me, and he says, "Soldier, you still need to salute for 76 hours." And I looked at him, and I says, "So how long do you have to salute?" And that was the end of that story. He walked off, didn't say a word. So I went home. My dad had to pick me up in Missoula. That's the closest airport, 100 miles away from where we lived in Darby. So the first thing he says to me in the car is, "So, did you fire your weapon in Vietnam?" And I says, "I never even put a round in the chamber." The closest I came, we were out on guard duty, and then the Spirit told me this guy was up there asleep. He's on drugs and stuff. So I went up, and the bolt, I could kick the bolt forward on my gun without loading it or anything. And so I went up there, and I kicked him in the side as hard as I could. And as he come through too, I let that bolt come forward in that night air. And he thought, I says, "Are you going to stay asleep or are you going to stay awake?" And he stayed awake. I went up there and checked on him every once in a while, and he stayed awake. And so I told my dad that story, and he says, "Well, that's fascinating." And I says, "Well, it's more fascinating than that, because I never had to go on guard duty or anything where I needed a rifle. I always had to carry one. And it was really fun because we were out there on the perimeter and I could shoot it all night. And it was really fun to shoot the grenade launcher and different things like that, the machine gun and different things, because the enemy's just out there and I'm going to shoot them. So it's kind of fun." And I never did. That blessing is a blessing I never heard, that I didn't remember. And it's one I lived. And so because of a few things like that, it changed my whole experience in Vietnam. In our life today, we do things and we think, oh, maybe the Lord is helping us. Maybe the Lord ain't. But the Lord is. And that's what I learned in Vietnam, that the Lord is there. The Lord tells our prophets what to say, what to do, and everything because of that. It's not some doofy guy getting up there and telling us a story. It's our prophets that tell us those stories. And so that's my story of Vietnam.